Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Develop Brighton 2023. It's great to see so many faces here, some old faces, some new faces. I hope the next 3 days prove to be both informative, but also a little bit of fun down by the south coast here. Weather looks good, so let's make the most of it. I'm going to leave you in the very capable hands of Will Freeman and hand you over to him to kick off the today's keynote. Over to you. Thank you, Will.
Nice one. Thank you so much, Andy. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, let's do that. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I'm sure you know why you're here on account of you sitting in the room. Very briefly, I'm Will Freeman. I'm a games journalist, writer, editor, that kind of thing in the games industry. In places like PC Gamer and Edge and the Garden GI and so on. But we don't need to hear too much about me. We're here, of course, to meet the fascinating Chris Charla, sat to my left, of course. Senior Director of ID at Xbox, formerly Portfolio Director over at XBLA. Yep. And before that, I won't go into too much detail here because I don't want to steal Chris's thunder. But yeah, previously of Independent Powerhouse Foundation, loads of fascinating stuff in games. Yeah, let's give a warm welcome to Chris. Break the ice once more. Hopefully make at least me feel a little bit less nervous. Yeah, we're here not to talk about, I think we can hopefully all agree, indie games are incredible and full of kind of amazing, exciting stuff. And we're definitely going to delve into that. But we also want to talk about a kind of tremendous or even profound kind of value and influence in the wider medium and kind of shaping the wider games industry. So I guess it's time for me to stop nervously talking too quick and start to put some questions over to Chris. So an obvious starting point really, Chris, but where you first really fell in love with games, like what was your falling for the medium? When did that start? And perhaps when did you realize you wanted to do more than just play, more than just consume games?
So I think my first game that I ever played was Pong. It's like a little kid. Yeah. It was well after it came out, but it was probably in the late 70s. But my mother wanted to hang out with her friend at a diner or something, so she gave us a quarter. It's like, right. And that was in the era when there was an arcade machine in like every shop. And obviously I loved it. But I think like the first games I really got into were like Space Invaders and then Zork on the Apple II, the old text adventure. I don't even think I could really read, but like an older kid was reading the room descriptions, and I was like, oh, say Echo or whatever, and like that kind of thing. And I think like everybody else in this room, I was hooked like the second I started playing. Like it never occurred to me to do anything different. Like it never. As soon as I understood that people made video games for a living, I was just like, that's that,
Yeah. So you felt that from the moment you were a player, and you were someone who wanted to be involved.
Yeah, and I did a bunch of different, like I majored in geography at college. I did a bunch of different things, but like I never really deviated from that kind of idea.
So how did that kind of passion turn into, I guess, making games and ultimately working in games? Like, did the making part start before the career started, or how was your journey into games?
I mean, probably like a lot of people, like luck plays such a huge role. Nobody ever wants to say that. Everybody wants to be like, work hard, everything will be fine. But like, luck really, really helps. And but I left college and I was really into the punk scene, as you know, and there was this awesome punk scene happening in the West Coast of the U.S. Around Berkeley and Gilman Street and everything like that. And there's also in my head, that's where all the video game magazines were, and I loved magazines and I loved video games, and it's like I want to work at a video game magazine and I want to go to Gilman Street. So I just moved to California and started squatting in an abandoned bus depot.
That's not for very long. Games, everybody. Squat on abandoned bus depot. No, sorry, carry on.
No, I had a Macintosh too, and I quickly got in a house because my housemate was like wanted to do animation with the Mac or whatever. And but yeah, I managed to like luck out, get a job at the US version of Edge, and then did that for a few years and helped start IGN, and then started working as an independent developer kind of in the bad old days when independent developers were mostly doing work for hire, publishers had a huge amount of leverage, and the the downside of that was that publishers had all the leverage and, a struggle to get dev kits and everything like that. But the upside of that is when you're in those days, when you were kind of working in like the licensed game mines, nobody cared what you did. And so if you were like, oh, I'm really interested in stealth games, but like this publisher wants me to make a pony game, I can just make a stealth pony game, and as long as it ships on time, you know what I mean? And so we had a lot of fun like doing that, and just like a lot of fun just like making the games that we wanted to make with the appropriate license on them. But along the way, we discovered, or we got into Xbox Live Arcade games, and that was like, to me, like mind blowing. And I had gotten my 360. I'd like stood out in like freezing rain like all night, to get a 360 right when they first came out, and brought it home or to my mother-in-law's house. And like the game that I bought was like a PS2 port, and it didn't feel next gen. It felt very much like, oh, we're playing a PS2 game. And then I hooked up to the internet and started downloading XBLA games, because we'd actually shipped some for launch. And I was like, oh my God, this is the future. Like I just got a bunch of games. Like, and in those days, XBLA demos would just ship every Wednesday, and you could auto download them to your Xbox. And so it was like the future. You just come home on a Wednesday night and play games. And so that's kind of how I got, and then a few years later, I got a job at Microsoft doing XBLA stuff.
Yeah.
So.
And actually, just very briefly, it dawns on me as you talk about XBLA, feels like it was yesterday, but that was quite a while. So just for anybody, like a little overview of XBLA, just to set the context for idea.
It's amazing. So Xbox Live Arcade was, it started, if you talk to the folks who worked on it, they really thought it was going to be a sort of like nice to have, and they thought it was going to be just downloading old arcade games, maybe casual games. But it like anything, you give a tool to game developers, they figure out a way to make awesome games with it. And I think that developers suddenly saw this avenue, and it's hard to understand now because it's so downloadable games are so ubiquitous, it's so obvious. But in 2004, 2005, before the iPhone, when, everything like that, the idea that like, I can just download this game. I don't have to put it on a disc. I don't have to worry about manufacturing. I don't have to worry about logistics and shipping discs on trucks to stores and justifying the $60 purchase price and blah, blah, blah. I can just like make a game and charge $5 for it. Was like hugely liberating. And we saw that with like the Summer of Arcade, starting in 2008, which is like 15 years ago now. I think it's like 30% of the game industry ago. Like if you think of the game industry starting in 1972, like it's like it's like
well, that's just why you're talking.
Amazing.
I was like, I remember like was that disc you had to get with XBLA. I was like, oh God, that was absolutely ages ago. So good to do a primer for hopefully for everybody's benefit. So like let's I think everybody's probably heard the like what's an indie game thing. We don't need to worry too much about kind of defining indie, but why is it valid or even important to separate out indie as something, just perceiving it separately, both in terms of kind of creatively and business wise? I almost wonder, like, will there be a point when indie isn't, we don't need to talk about that separation, but why now do we need to separate it out?
So I think for consumers, we actually need to separate it less and less.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So I think like as a consumer, consumers just think about games. Like this game is cool, that game's uncool. I want this, I want that. And so for a consumer, like Call of Duty and Castle Crashers are both things that they may have, that they may play.
Yeah.
I was just on vacation. I met some, folks who are a lot younger who like don't work in video games, but they play video games. And I was like, what games do you play? And they named a bunch of AAA games. And I was like, we're talking, exchange gamer tags at each other. And I looked at what they actually played, and they played a ton of indie games, through Game Pass and everything. But like, they didn't define themselves as indie gamers. They kind of defined themselves as like sports gamers. Like I play Madden, I play hockey, and I'm like, oh, you also play Tunic. Like I can see your achievements, And and so I think for like on a creative side, I don't think you need to separate them. But I think there is still value in separating them on the business side, because typically indie developers are much smaller. They have just a totally different relationship in terms of capitalization and how often games come out and things like that. And so I think that on the business side, there's still a huge difference between AAA and indie. Although on the creative side, you know, the output might be different, but from a consumer perspective, they're all just video games.
And something we spoke about kind of in the build up to this was like often it's seen as kind of innovation being the thing that separates out indie games. It's fascinating, like how important or defining is that element? It was just interesting to think like when that doesn't matter. So
yeah, you know, it's like what I always think about is I kind of define indie as, you know, when somebody says like, what is indie? And I know we've talked a lot about punk rock in our like conversations, you know, offline and
quite
stuff.
Distracted. We talked a lot about skateboarding and fanzines and punk. Not the topic.
I know. I feel bad for our PR person that has to endure like 15 minutes of old talk. But in the 90s, I spent an enormous amount of time fighting about what was and wasn't punk. Yeah. And it was very rule-based and, you know, like doctrinaire, you know, for this allegedly radical thing. Yeah. And so I've never gotten too uptight about what is and isn't an indie game because I think all those muscles are just burned out. But for me, it comes down to creative freedom. Like that's ultimately what it's about. If you've got complete creative freedom and you're just making the game you want to make, like you're independent, right? Mm-hmm. Whether you're being funded by, you know, yourself or a big company or whatever. And when you talk about innovation, like, so when you talked about innovation just now, but I would use the term creative freedom because like it kind of comes in multiple ways. Like for a lot of people, creative freedom is like, I'm going to innovate. I'm going to do something experimental. I'm going to try something new. But for other people, you know, we're all nostalgic, and for other people, creative freedom is like, I'm going to make something that is exactly the way I remember this, and I'm going to try and recapture this game from my childhood or my first gameplay experience. And a lot of times what you'll see people work to do is recapture the feeling of that game, not just slavishly recreate that game, although some people do go ahead and like limit themselves to, you know, old palettes and things like that. But I think about a game like Tunic, and what I love about it is that, you know, Andrew, when he was making that game, was trying to recapture the feeling of discovery and mysteries and hearing things on the playground about a game and just wanting to run home and try it and you know, all those kinds of things. But he actually packed so many more secrets and so many more mysteries into that game than existed in, you know, like the sum total of the Nintendo Entertainment System. But it feels the way you remember those games feeling, even though it's actually much deeper and you know, more intense. So yeah. I love that
distinction of creative freedom. I guess there's sometimes that pressure for innovation, right? Create something entirely new, and sometimes the most wonderful experiences are kind of innovating in confines of a genre. So it's nice to think creative freedom includes the freedom not to innovate,
exactly.
so to speak. Or
includes the freedom to simply polish and produce something just really.
So I guess, the kind of one of the things I really wanted to get onto was this influence over the wider medium. You know, it was interesting you saying like players themselves, kind of for large groups of them, aren't really thinking about the structure and independence of the studio behind the games. But is there, let's start with the kind of creatively and in terms of design and so on, is indie really having an influence over the kind of games AAA games can be?
I think it is, and in two ways. One is that, you know, we're all developers. We all just look at what other developers are doing, you know, and so when you see, you know, when a developer at a AAA studio sees some indies doing something cool and they play the games like that, and seeing the risk taking can frequently pay off. I think it helps people take more risks. And then I think, like, just on a really concrete example that was like, I don't have a diary, but if I did, I would have written about it when I got home that night. You know, for you know, everyone in the game industry knows, you know, when there's a hot game, lots of people think about it. It influences a lot, and lots of people will, you know, if you're getting pitches or pitching, you know, that name will come up. So, you know, I remember all the way back to Tony Hawk or Doom. You know, after Tony Hawk was big, every pitch was like, "Wow, it's kind of got some Tony Hawk elements," you know, or "Oh, it's like Doom in a corridor," you know, or whatever. And and it's always a AAA game, which is totally fine. It's like we're adding some Dark Souls elements to this, whatever, to this platformer, and that's super cool. It's just totally natural. But I had a meeting with or I think like in the last year or so, more than one meetings with AAA devs that, just in my role at Microsoft, I don't just meet with indie devs, and all of a sudden they were like, what we really want to do is, like take some design lessons from Hades.
Right.
And I was definitely like, take some design from Hades. and that was really cool. That's the first time I've ever heard, and I heard multiple times in the same year, like AAA devs explicitly referencing an indie developer in terms of like what they're doing. But I think you see that influence everywhere, and I actually think like whether you're looking at AAA or indie right now, like there's more progression and innovation maybe than we give credit for. Like it's very popular on Twitter to just say like, oh, these games don't innovate anymore. But like actually, if you actually look at video games, like they all innovate. They're all doing interesting things. And I think that some of that, the level of progression that we see today is like 100% down to the influence of independent developers.
And is there an element to that of kind of, I guess indie games, many indie games have been very successful, whether you creatively, critically, commercially. Is there an element perhaps of kind of AAA devs seeing what consumers are open-minded, like indie offering a kind of lens to allow AAA devs and larger publishers to kind of see what they're allowed to potentially do and what audiences accept?
I think so, absolutely. And I was trying to think of some examples of that, and like I think like Battle Royale is a great example, right? I mean, like the first-person shooter has existed for 1,000 years, or whatever, not 1,000 years. It's existed for a long time, and and it like and for Bluehole or PUBG Corporation to just kind of like grab a mod and release that as a frontline game, and then see the influence that it's had across all AAA spaces. Like I don't think there's any AAA first-person shooter that doesn't have like a Battle Royale mode now. It's just cool to see that, and I don't know that in the olden days if that innovation would have happened, and maybe because it didn't need to, or maybe because it just was harder to do. But now it's like you may think that a semi-annualized franchise is always the same, but if you play the one from 3-4 years ago, with exceptions, like they actually are doing a lot. So
there's just something really cool in that notion that kind of indie showing AAA what AAA can be. Like, it kind of reverses the kind of more traditional narrative around that. Kind of to ask the same question, I just wanted to talk about how much indie has shaped the likes of, I guess, engines, general game tech, and even things like we kind of, there's nothing new here in 2023, but desktop mocap systems rather than having to go to a huge setup. But how profound has indie's influence been on game tech and engines and so on? And how's that played out?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it like the one answer I want to give is like, oh, well, it's hard to do a chicken and an egg answer there, but it's probably more like about just as the moon revolves around the Earth is actually revolving, revolving around the moon at the same time. And I think that like indies have helped influence, the growth of different technologies, but also been super influenced by like the democratization of development that Unity and Unreal and Yo-Yo and others have like brought, like just because you think about even some of the big hitter, canonically famous indie games like Cuphead, like that got started because those brothers read about Unity and they were like, what? Like somebody can download a program and make a video game? And like next thing you know, and by next thing, like 7 years later, like Cuphead ships, and so it's been kind of like a case of dual influence where like the ease, I mean, it's still exceptionally difficult to make a video game no matter how easy you make it, but like the easing of development difficulty, thanks to all the awesome middleware and engines that are out there, has been a huge influence. And then also just watching what indies can do with that technology and with, scrappy mocap systems and things like that has just been fascinating to see games that, you think about like 10 years ago would have taken a team of like 70 is now done by a team of like 7 or maybe 4.
Yeah.
And that is like, it's scary in one sense, to think like, oh, if I'm making a game, I have to do a lot to keep up. But on the other hand, it's really liberating to know that like all these things that used to just feel completely out of reach are just, totally in your grasp now as a developer.
Cuphead's fascinating as well, because I guess that even tips over to indie shaping popular culture. Like, anyone who's spent more than 10 seconds with me, I talk about 2D shooters or shmups quite a lot, and it's always been this niche, and it was always like importing weird games from Japan. Suddenly one day I turn on Netflix, and the most popular show in the UK that day is Cuphead, right? So I guess indie games I guess because games are such an influential force, it can roll on beyond that. So Cuphead, a fascinating example there. And do you see, we've talked a little about engines there, like publishing platforms. Do you see indie shaping those?
Yeah, I mean, like...
here you are, right?
Yeah. Definitely changed things at Xbox. Like, and in the 360 era, I mean, and this is one of the reasons ID at Xbox came to exist. Like, you had to be a sort of AAA publisher to like publish a game even digitally on Xbox, and there were a lot of reasons for that. Like some of them were technical, some of them were business, but obviously like and Xbox had this amazing kind of like pioneering spirit with XBLA, and then we really kind of like lost our way a little bit as the progress and progression of the indie game movement like way outstripped like our ability as a platform holder to follow at the sort of the tail end of the 360. And that was the genesis of ID at Xbox, really, was like, oh my gosh, how do we like get ahead of this and help out? But it's been a dramatic influence. And early on, there were people who, totally fairly were like, is this just like some PR ploy? Is this, it's nice that you're here, but are you going to be here next year? We know how, these things can go. But, it's been like 10 years now, and we're still here. So that's like 20% of the game industry, so that's pretty cool. And then you look at like, for me, the thing that I always chart when I'm trying to get kind of extrinsic validation for how important indie games are to Microsoft is like, well, how many are at our big summer showcase, right? And when you look at just the number of minutes, we used to group all the indie games together at the E3 presentations because it was important to contextualize them at the time, I think. And then at a certain point, we were just like, we don't need to do that anymore. And, we don't need to like do an ID montage, like on the main stage. Like we can just have these games like stand on their own. And, but I can tell you that like the number of minutes that there are devoted to indie games in that like presentation is huge. And the number of like, looking at even Microsoft's biggest initiatives like Game Pass, we've had almost 600 ID games or games that came through the ID program in Game Pass. And so it's like, it's foundational,
Yeah, and that was a moment. And to be fair, some other publishers did it as well, where suddenly it was AAA and indie not distinguished, right? And that makes me think actually about kind of balancing. I'll tell you, before I get to that, like Xbox and Microsoft, I think everyone here knows they're a pretty large commercial entity. Like that's what Microsoft and Xbox are. So how can that be applied to something like, well, how do you make sure you're meaningfully helpful? And I guess to extend the question, also that kind of balancing, maintaining their independence, and you can bring this kind of scale, right? So but let's start. How can such a large corporation be meaningfully helpful to indies?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, when we got ID at Xbox going, the one insight that like that I'll say that I've ever had in the game industry was that like indie games were crucially important and that players were really going to want to play them, right? And so then it just became, so our goal is we need to make sure we're giving players this huge variety of games. How do we actually make that happen? And, in 10 years ago, the answer was like, make it as, again, I'll use the word easy, but we all know it's not easy, as straightforward as possible to ship. So just, make it easy to ship. And we started the program by doing this huge listening tour. It felt huge at the time. We talked to like 50 developers. I think we have like almost 5,000 developers in the program now. So tiny fraction, but we've never stopped listening. And, you know, luckily developers have never been shy about telling us when we're messing up or telling us when we're doing well. And things have evolved, right? So, you know, 10 years ago, it was just platform access was like the real thing. Like, let me self-publish. Like, what are you doing? And so we kind of got that box ticked. And then, you know, as time has gone on, there's been more and more things that developers need. And, you know, what can like Microsoft as a big giant company do? Like, we can help in like, I'd say probably like a few different ways, one of which is just data, right? So a typical independent developer, way they differ from AAA is that you're only working on one game at a time usually, and it can be years between releases. And you know, if most devs are kind of heads down making the game, when they pop their heads up, you know, hopefully 6 months before they ship or more, like all their knowledge about how you sell a video game or what works for selling a video game is now like 4 years old. And like, I guarantee like 4-year-old strategies for selling indie games online are like not going to work. And so, you know, one thing we can do is just work really hard to, you know, we get to see how every game sells, at least on Xbox, and to just let developers know, like, hey, these are the trends we're seeing. This genre is doing, you know, performing like this. This genre is performing like this. You know, Friday is the best day to release your game on Xbox because it's a new releases all weekend. That said, we just told everybody it's Friday. Think about Wednesday, you know, that kind of thing. And, you know, and we try and give developers all this data that we can, you know, without revealing confidential, you know, single game sales data, and then let them make the decisions as the business people and as the publishers. I think the other big place that we do it is with discovery. Mm-hmm. You know, discovery has become like the challenge of our age. You know, like when there was only, you know, a couple hundred games, you know, it used to be on Xbox, they would release an XBLA game every Wednesday. And it was just a little bit before my time because I joined after it had been going a while. But, you know, they would sometimes struggle to find a game to release on a Wednesday, like struggle to find a video game to release that week on Xbox. And like, those were good days if you were one of those games that was the game that came out that week. You know, today, you know, we have, you know, dozens of games sometimes come out a week on Steam. We all know, I think, had maybe 10,000 games come out last year. I mean, it's really tricky, right? And a lot of our discovery work, and I mean the whole game industries, but Xbox is included, has been like, how do we help players find cool games, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really valuable work that continues, and we're still doing that on the store every day. But a new lens to look at that through, which I think is kind of like, as I think about the next 10 years, like place we're really going to be focusing, is that like there's enough games players on the planet, you know, literally billions of people playing video games, you know, one way or another, that if you have a game that is good, you know, if you have a game that's bad, the market can be pretty rational sometimes. But if you have a game that's good, there should be an audience for that game out there, right? And so how do we help developers find their audience? Even if it's a game that maybe is like a niche game, you know, that the total addressable market is, you know, 60,000, but it's made by one person. So if they can sell 30,000, they're going to be fine. Like, how do we help them find those 30,000 out of, you know, and billions of players? And I think there's some things that that is where you want like a big company like Microsoft thinking about it. And so I think there's some things we can think about there. And then the last place I think that as a big giant company we can help is doing deals, honestly. Like whether it's and I'll talk about a couple different like vectors of deals. So there's obviously Game Pass deals, which are cool and can help players or help games get, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of downloads like right away, really increase awareness, and also they come with money. And so it can be really good for making your game break even or profitable like day one. And then one of the things that we started to see a few years ago pre-pandemic was that we would go around to shows and we'd see cool games from maybe underrepresented developers who maybe first time in games. And, you know, and say like, oh, what are you platforms coming out on? And it would be like PC and then maybe a console that was an Xbox. And so we started to feel stressed that we were like failing in our goal to deliver broad variety of games to our players. And we were kind of doubly failing because there were these underrepresented developers who weren't getting their games on Xbox. So we were just like bad. And so we started this thing called the Developer Acceleration Program, or now called that, it had another name originally, specifically to help just pay for ports. And so to help get that content there, to make sure that those developers got their voices out there and that our players got access to this broad variety of things. And we always kept it, like we didn't do PR around it or announce it publicly because we were like, this is a gap. It's not something we're trying to brag about. But this GDC, we did two things. We announced it publicly because we wanted to make sure that devs who we didn't know knew about it, which has been cool because I think since GDC, something like 60% of the games that we've signed through that program came in post GDC and we didn't know about them. So that's neat. And then the other thing we announced at GDC is it's always been stressful that people had to know someone at Xbox to pitch a game, right? And like, even though we're eager to see pitches, like hit us up, like there's a finite number of us, and so we're actually very soon going to be launching an update to our like private, like our behind NDA portal or whatever, and you can just be like pitch a game, and it's going to get looked at by like all the key decision makers, and I think that'll be pretty cool.
And in terms of kind of maintaining that autonomy, I guess you're much more hands-off with the game. Although you can provide that data and information to guide it, you're much more hands-off when it comes to
when it comes to the actual game. I had to be careful about how I say this because I think it could be like taken out of context, like a terrible quote.
Your PRs look tough.
I know. I mean, the way we like, I'll say it this way: the I Did Xbox program, like. We're not interested in influencing the games that people make, right?
Yeah.
Somebody wants us to play a game and give feedback, we always will. But we want everything, and we just are not bothered about the types of games.
By everything, kind of every type of
exactly. And so we do a lot of like sort of under NDA conferences and stuff where we talk a lot about commercial success because that's where our goals like line up directly with developers and can give you 10 mistakes you can make to do your launch and 11 things you can do to make sure people, buy more of your games. Focus on your box art, 100%, please. But one of the things when we do those talks is we always caveat it by saying like, look, we're talking about commercial success because that's where our interests align and that's where Microsoft actually knows, a lot. But there's so many different reasons to make a game: creative success, critical success, just that personal satisfaction of completing a project. And we want it all. And, in the XBLA days, we would have producers assigned to games and they would really, exercise like a big editorial voice on like, don't make it so you run left at the beginning. It's a platformer. Make it so you run right, things like that. But today, I think developers don't need that help. Developers know how to make video games. They don't need Microsoft telling them how to do it. So
sure. And you kind of mentioned the thing about perfect box art. I just to move to some kind of advice questions for developers and publishers in the audience. You're allowed to suggest idea Xbox, but not straight away. You can't just say speak to idea Xbox to answer all of these. You can at the end of the sentence. So let's talk. You mentioned commercial. Like there's a lot of options. You could fill a conference, let alone one question and one panel talking about kind of. But do you have any general advice on kind of funding, budget? I guess again with that maintaining your indiness, right? How should people start to even look at that landscape with their kind of indiness in mind?
Well, I think that if you're making a video game, maybe you shouldn't think about it day one. You know what I mean? But maybe like day 11. You should pause for a second, like over a cup of coffee or something. And I always suggest that you just think about like what you're getting into and why you're getting into it. And there's a lot you can do once you get to that point. And again, this isn't just Xbox advice. This is just general advice. I think it makes sense to understand early on what the potential commercial outcomes for your game are. And that doesn't mean that everyone should be trying to make a game that they feel like is going to be a commercial hit, right? Like, there's a lot of artists who make art that they know isn't going to be, necessarily commercially viable, but they make it because they're artists and they have to, And so I think games are the same way. So I don't say like, you should stop and think about whether or not your game is going to be commercially successful before you keep going. Except to the extent that being commercially successful is why you're making the game, right? And so I do think it makes sense to look at things like, look at the data on Steam, which is, where you can get the most kind of numbers, and understand, for the genre, what's kind of the floor, what's kind of the ceiling, and, I'll be someplace in between, but don't just look at the genre, like spend some time to say like, okay, for the art style, okay, so like, I'm going to make a platformer. I know the floor is 50 units and the ceiling is, 50 million, but like, if I'm going to do pixel art, what's the floor on pixel art? What's the ceiling on pixel art? If I'm going to make it black and white, what's the floor on black and white? What's the ceiling on black and white? If I'm going to make it for kids, what's the floor and ceiling on that? And then start to combine all those and understand that your floor is probably the lowest floor you found, and your ceiling is probably the lowest ceiling you found. And and if that's fine, just move forward. But if that is not fine, you need to think about that. And I think like, to me, like one of the I'm gonna call it it probably isn't. I'm trying to think. I need to think. My jet lagged brain wanted to say a different word. It's easy to get into a commercial situation where you put too many people on a project versus, that will make it really tough for the project to group. And when you see some projects that are been quite small and had like huge success, the opposite actually is also true, right? You can put a small team on and have like outside success, but you can put too many people on a project. So that's something I'd just sort of think about.
Right, fascinating. And actually, you were talking about kind of zeroing in on your style there. So all this doesn't particularly naturally follow what you just said. You did mention before, like getting your box art and stuff, right? Like, I definitely want to talk about kind of presence and discoverability and getting your game out there. But let's just talk. I'd love to hear about that kind of advice for indies in presenting your game, shall we say? And I'd love to hear more about the box art, especially in this era of not having boxes so much.
This is like if you talk to me for any length of time, I will eventually start yelling about box art, because it's really important. Like, and I think that like, look, the only way we sell, typically indie games sell these days, some do have physical editions, but most of them are digital, right? And you need to spend time as a developer looking at the stores. You need to look at the Switch store, you need to look at the PlayStation store, you need to look at the Xbox store, you need to look at the Steam store, the GOG store, etc., Epic store. And you need to understand how games get sold in each of those stores and really tailor your experience for each of those stores uniquely. And the kind of one of the saddest things we see is a developer who's made like a brilliant piece of box art that looks fantastic on their monitor, which is 18 inches from their head, right? The monitor's about here, maybe 20. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to do this in metric. Arm's length away from your body. It looks fantastic on the screen, right? But when you're on a couch meters away from your television, like it's just, and the box isn't very big, it's just unreadable. And it just, that just totally kills people's desire to click through. And no matter how much attention you get before the game comes out, most people in the world are going to experience your game first through the new releases section of a store, right? And so you have to have that box art be really visually arresting on the target platform. So for Steam, I think you can do that detailed box art because people are going to be seeing it right in front of their face. On Xbox, on PlayStation, they're not. On Switch, gosh, they might be seeing it right here, or they might be seeing it over there, and you kind of have to think about both those scenarios. And then as people click in to, on Xbox, I think we call it the game details page, and I'm sure there's similar titles for other platforms. Like, how do you make that text super arresting in every language that people can see it in? Which is like the answer is do not use automatic translation. Like, no matter what if you're going to pay for anything in development, pay to have a human translate your store text, because all you'll do is offend people in a language you can't read or write, like if you try and have it done automatically. And then just those screenshots or trailer videos have to be awesome. Like, I always tell people, this is how you can just like cut 60% of your sales in an instant. Is it's towards the end of development, you're really tired, you got to upload all this stuff to the stores, irritated, all the stores want the same stuff differently, and it's so tempting to just hit the space button 6 times and be like, there's some screenshots. Like, I'm done with this. I'm going to bed. And you just uploaded like 6 screenshots of your like options screen, and no one's ever going to buy your game. And so don't make that mistake. Like, and we see it all the time. Can I talk about one more mistake?
Yeah, mate. Yeah, please. Yeah, you're here to talk about these things. Carry on.
One more thing, just I would warn against is coming out with an indie game on the day of a big release, right? And you might say, we had a dev like one time, and they wanted to launch on the same day as like Halo, and we were like, it's a really bad day to launch, and they were like, well, our game's not anything like Halo. I'm like, okay. Here's the problem. Like I talked earlier, players don't really distinguish between indie games and AAA games. They just like video games. And your game might not be anything like Halo, but that doesn't mean that the people who will enjoy your game won't also enjoy Halo. And just they're probably going to be paying attention to Halo the day it comes out, right? And so, just because of the amount of publicity and buzz and everything like that. So it's really hard to do counter programming in video games right now, I think. And so I think you're better off just kind of trying to avoid the big things. That may not be true forever. I think it's true today. In 10 years, it might not be true at all. Like you can totally counter program movies and TV shows and stuff like that. But I think right now games is hard to do.
And counter programming just refers to, I guess, almost in the old school version of programming on at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. And actually, I guess that kind of carries over actually, first of all, lingering on that point for a moment, what about, because I really want to talk more about getting your game out there, about the kind of presence of your game in studio and which comes first, but as well as releasing your games, there's kind of building up and getting attention. Should you be avoiding, I was going to say E3, but one of the big ones that in terms of just there being news and information about other games, I'm wondering even like when on earth do you release? Because there's always going to be stuff going on.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. And I think that the answer for it changes all the time because, I think the conventional wisdom, one day will be like, announce your game immediately. The second you have Hello World on screen, announce your game and just talk about it for the next N number of years till you ship. And then, the conventional wisdom will drift to like, to announce it like 4 months before it ships, like, strike while the iron's hot. And then no matter what, your game's going to slip. And so like trying to time that, what the right strategy is, it's really tricky, right? I think like, I'll go back to Cuphead, I think like they announced really early in a time when that was the conventional wisdom. And then the conventional wisdom changed to don't announce early. And people are like, oh, and then the conventional wisdom changed back by the time they finally shipped. So it's like it all worked out.
Right.
So,
toss a 365-sided coin.
Yeah, exactly. And so I do think it's a situation where like, it is a useful time to like have your head up, like, and talk to people about like what the, what makes sense. And, does, and, you see people do everything from, hey, I'm going to do something with Nintendo. So I get in a direct, I'm going to talk to Xbox. So I get on stage at E3. I'm going to, do something with PlayStation. I'm going to be in the Steam Demo Fest or the Xbox Demo Fest, like all these are valid things. It's hard to say which one's going to work. So given that, there's no sense in not just trying as many of them as you can.
Yeah. And just one more on this point in terms of advice for indies around kind of this presence and discoverability and getting noticed. I often kind of think, it's when the person's like, are you promoting? I guess I'm talking about PR here, really.
Yeah.
But do you thrust your game out? Is it better to establish your studio's presence and reputation, even put I kind of tend to remember the human beings rather than the game company logo. Like I just, how to get out there beyond partnering.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the dev, right? Like some devs are like, will have like a person who they're really comfortable being the face of the game or the face of the company. And they're a gregarious tweeter or threader or blue sky socialer. Yeah. And then some devs are not interested in that, and they just want the game to be the thing that they talk about. And then some devs don't want to do any of it, and they should work with a publisher or a PR firm to do it for them because it's just not their forte. Some people love it, and some people don't. And I think it kind of going back to creative freedom, like you have this sort of promotional freedom to do what works for you. And you you can usually find what works, what feels comfortable, and and hopefully that's something that people are going to respond to. I do think there's, with all the churn that's happening right now in social networks, I think there is some good opportunities to get on some of the new networks, whether it's Blue Sky or Threads or whatever, to kind of establish some, I don't know what the word is, beachhead or whatever, just to like build up a following there.
Yeah. So it does seem like there's many, I guess there are too many, but many ways for an indie to have presence these days. But what about the publishing choice, the routes to market, right? There's so many options now. How does the studio, is it about promotional freedom again? How does the studio even begin the decision-making total self-publishing you can self-publish to itch, right? I guess it depends on those motivations and what your definition of success
it does.
is.
And I think some of it also just depends on what's comfortable for you. There's some devs who want to self-publish. They just want to do it all. And they want to keep all the money themselves. And that is awesome. There's other devs who think about what and the thing I would just encourage people to think about is just what those things mean. Like, what does self-publishing means? It means it's all on you. Like, maybe you are able to hire a marketing firm or a PR firm, but like everything is going to fall on you. And then it's like, well, what does it mean if I work with a publisher? Well, it means they're going to do a lot, but they're going to take some money, and like maybe that's okay because they're going to make the pie that much bigger. And maybe it doesn't matter if it's okay or not okay because you don't want to do it anyway. Or you think about your skill set and you're like, no, that's not me. Don't do something that makes you uncomfortable because that's what the cool kids say you should do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do what feels right for you. And I think the beauty that we've seen over the last few years is that there's like paths to like ridiculous levels of success in any metric, whether it's commercial or critical or anything, through all different manners. There's like awesome paths to success working with publishers. There's awesome paths to success working by yourself. There's awesome paths to success working with, what I'd call publishing service providers who do some things but not other things. And it's just a matter of making sure that the folks you may or may not be partnering with, that you have a good fit with them. Like, if you leave a meeting and you're like, we clicked, those people were rad, like that was great, that's somebody you want to work with. If you leave a meeting thinking like, oh, man, I don't know, but like, well, they got some money, I don't know, like, okay, we're all business people, we have to make decisions, but like, you should, feel good about the working relationship.
So that kind of cultural fit or even personal fit,
is
more, obviously it's nice to have that, but it sounds like that's kind of more than just nice.
Yeah, I think it's crucial to have, because like, you don't want to be working with somebody you dislike or disagree with for, years, right? Like, that's just not like a nice way to live.
Yeah, I'm self-employed. I know exactly how that feels like. I guess what's really nice is like your, all that, through this discussion of advice, it's kind of like, remember to be indie, and even like be independent from the definition of what independent is, right? Just keep, like, you can put trust and faith in doing it the way you want to do it, rather than thinking I should go route.
Yeah, absolutely. And just think about like what's going to make the most sense for you, what's going to make the most sense for your game, and what you're trying to get out of it. It kind of does go back to taking a moment at the beginning of development to think about what you want the end product to look like, not just the video game, but everything around the video game.
And I'm actually going to rewind a bit. Before the advice, we were talking about indie's influence, and just the way the conversation went, I skip past one that'd be nice to linger on a bit is, do we see, I guess I'm almost talking about like studio models, studio management, kind of working practice. What from indie is being inherited by the wider industry? Do we see an influence that way? And
I think we do a little bit, although I think that I think if you look at like across the industry now, there's way more developers working the way indies have in the past, with distributed teams and that kind of thing. But I don't think that's that people saw the way indies were doing it and were like, oh, that seems cool. although it does, I think a lot of it is COVID, right? You know, and we were all forced. I think COVID kind of pushed us like 25 years forward on the whole digital transition. And I think for teams that were already distributed during COVID, life was a little bit easier than teams that had to like learn distributed development, under duress. But I think like now we're in a place that is it's kind of better where all devs kind of have more freedom to pick what works for them. And you see some studios like Iron Galaxy talked about this at DICE. After COVID, they were like, you know what? We like being a studio that all works in the same place. That's what we're going to do. And that's totally fair. And then other studios were like, oh, after COVID, we just got rid of our office and we're done with that. And that's fair too. I think we're in an era now where there's so many development modalities. I don't know if that's the right word that work. That it's there's a bunch of things that work.
Right. So it's almost like, mate, because I'd say the word post-COVID, like you said, easy, put that in inverted commas, but regardless of COVID, it's left the legacy it has. It sounds like indies were well prepared to adapt, almost had the head start rather than necessarily setting a precedent for how to do things. Moving towards almost the final question, perhaps, is I guess I would know generally, I hope I know how you're going to answer this, which is effectively, are you optimistic about the future of indie games? Hopefully it's just not no enough to go, but like, are you? No, actually I'm done. No, like, why be optimistic? Let's put it that way. Why be optimistic about indie games now and going into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think like this question comes up a lot, and it's something that's like a heated discussion topic anytime you have one or more developers around each other, right? Which is, what's going on with the indie scene? Is it tanking? Is it rising? What's happening? And I've thought about this question a lot, like probably everyone in this room has. And I think people have had this exact same conversation since 1972, right? Mm-hmm. Like in 1972, they put Pong in, Andy Capp's Tavern, and like they're making tons of money and they saw this huge opportunity. And then they were also super worried because it was getting cloned or, this or that. And so I think like developers have always been, worried about business conditions changing in a negative way. But also always been like really, interested in like the new things. So I think when I hear questions about business conditions or worries about situations, is it harder to sell on this platform? Is it harder to sell on that platform? Is this threatening games? Is that threatening games? I think those are really reasonable questions for us to ask as business people, because in addition to being artists, like video game developers, indies are also small business people, and those are like reasonable things to be worried about. But on balance, when I look at the quality of video games that are being made today, when I look at the progression that is clearly there in video games in terms of art, in terms of technology, in terms of accessibility, in terms of any kind of vector that you want to look at, and then when you look, and this is where I feel the most optimistic, when I look at like the general public or civilians, people who buy video games, and to see how big that audience is and how growing it is, or how it's growing, and just the growing ubiquity of acceptance of video games as like an entertainment medium, which wasn't there 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. But now it's weird if somebody doesn't play video games, especially if they're, in a younger generation. Like it's actively strange if somebody doesn't,
It's almost like switching the kind of nerd who plays video game.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other way around, right?
We're old, we're damaged. Like we'll always kind of look at it as, as a weird thing, in a sense, a thing that we love. But like for a 12-year-old kid today, regardless of gender or anything else, like video games are completely as normal as reading a book. And that gives me so much hope for the future. And, we're going to be, it's going to be like 500 years from now. We're all going to be dead, or probably, and and there will be scholars talking about the implications of limbo and stuff like that. The same way people study Chaucer now, and that is so rad. And so I am super hopeful. You get to see, and I get to see, and probably everyone in this room gets to see their friends' games and their own games, and to just know like what's happening in the future, and just knowing where the game industry is going, just in the games. And you can't not be optimistic. There's always concerns about what about funding, what about this, what about that. But at the end of the day, the content that developers are making is so awesome. Like, it's gonna be sweet. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And it sounds like, almost to loop back to our first question when it's talking about you falling in love with the medium, like you are still excited it sounds like you're still excited as a player of indie games. Excited about the future as a player, and like you were standing in front of that Pong cabinet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, have you guys played them? Like, video games are amazing. So
we recommend try some video games, ladies and gentlemen. And that's the key takeaway from this.
No, it's like it's the best entertainment, I think it's the best like entertainment medium that's ever been created.
Yeah.
And so I don't think you can't help but be excited about them, and super fun.
Nice one. Well, that feels they've got a few minutes. I won't ask you the question about naming every idea Xbox game in chronological order. Now, how many has there been? How many releases have there been?
More than 2,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
Over how many?
10 years.
10 years.
It's more. I think it's more than 3,000. I have the numbers written down someplace. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, yeah. I think it's about the right time to leave it at that. Unless there's anything else just anything else you wanted to say, or like final thing to the indie developers here. If not,
no, I mean, if you have a game and you're not on Xbox already, please get in touch. And hopefully we're making it easier for people to pitch us for things like Game Pass inclusion and stuff like that. And yeah, thanks for listening to me go blah, blah,
nice
blah.
one. No, it's brilliant. And we've actually filled the time pretty much. We haven't got time to talk about skateboard bearings or the things we've been talking about in the build up to this. Never mind. I prefer cheap low ABEC bearings myself. Right, let's wrap it up, everyone. Thank you so much for your attention and focus. Of course, thank you to Chris. You can all go on to your next things. Thanks to Develop for having us, and see you about the show.
Yeah,
we're done.
Thanks, everybody. Right.